The story always began with whispers, not the kind spoken in churches or courtrooms where words carry the weight of ceremony and the expectation of truth. These were different. These were the low, rough whispers traded over campfires that had burned down to nothing but orange coals and gray ash passed between men whose hands were cracked from labor and whose faces were weathered by seasons that showed no mercy. These were the whispers exchanged across cracked wooden bars in dusty saloons where the beer was warm and the light was bad, and the only entertainment was the stories men told each other after the sun went down and the work was done and the silence of the frontier became too heavy to bear alone. The kind of whispers that grew legs. They traveled faster than any stagecoach winding through mountain passes, on the tongues of trappers and prospectors sliding down into valley towns, on the breath of peddlers and circuit preachers carried along creek beds by men panning for gold who had nothing to show for their labor but sore backs and tall tales. The whispers moved through the Colorado Territory the way water moves through limestone, slow and persistent, finding every crack, filling every hollow until the truth and the legend became so thoroughly tangled that no man alive could separate one from the other. And after a while, no man particularly wanted to, because the legend was better. The legend had teeth. They spoke of the Ferris brothers. Three men, identical in face and build, born together on the same stormy night in the spring of 1847, delivered by a midwife named Hazel Coombs, who swore on the grave of her departed husband that she had never seen anything like it in 40 years of catching babies and never wanted to again. She told anyone who would listen that the storm that night had been the worst she had seen in a decade, that the lightning had split the sky so many times it looked like God was cracking the world open with a hammer, and that when the third boy came out screaming, a bolt struck the pine tree outside the window and split it clean down the middle, leaving two halves standing like the posts of a gate that had just been opened to let something through. Judson Prosper and Ransom Ferris, triplets, mountain men, living somewhere up in the high country of the Colorado Territory, where the pine trees grew so tall they seemed to scrape the belly of heaven, and the air was so thin it could freeze your lungs solid if you breathed too deep or too careless. The men who told their stories in the saloons of Bedloe Gulch and the mining camps scattered through the foothills spoke of them the way sailors speak of storms they have survived, with respect that bordered on reverence, with a distance that was not quite fear but lived in the same neighborhood, with the quiet, unshakable understanding that these were creatures not fully tamed by civilization and never intended to be. They had built their cabin with their own hands, the story said, felled the timber themselves with axes forged from iron. They had smelted in a pit furnace dug into the mountainside, the kind of labor that would have broken most men before the first wall was raised. They hauled the foundation stones from the creek bed, each one so heavy it took two of them to carry while the third cleared the path. They roofed it with logs so thick and so carefully fitted that no winter storm, no matter how savage, could tear the structure apart. They chinked the gaps with moss and clay, sealed the joints with pine pitch. They boiled down themselves, and when they were finished, the cabin stood on the mountainside like something that had always been there, not built, grown, as natural and as immovable as the granite peaks that surrounded it. They hunted their own meat, elk and deer and the occasional bear that wandered too close to the cabin, and discovered too late that the Ferris brothers considered the clearing around their home to be sovereign territory defended with the same ferocity that nations defend their borders. They trapped their own furs, beaver and fox and marten, running trap lines that stretched for miles through timber so dense a man could lose his direction 10 steps from the trail. They broke their own horses on the high meadows, where the grass grew wild and thick, and the herds of elk moved across the hillsides in numbers so large they darkened the slope like a living shadow passing over the face of the mountain. And when they came down from the high country to trade their pelts and buy supplies in the little town of Bedloe Gulch, the people watched them the way a man watches a grizzly bear wander through his vegetable garden. Not with panic, not with the urge to run, but with the careful, measured attention of someone who understands that the creature before him operates by a set of rules that are older and simpler and far less negotiable than anything written in a book of law. They were enormous, all three of them, standing well over 6 feet tall, broad across the shoulders as barn doors, their arms thick with the kind of muscle that comes not from vanity or the deliberate cultivation of physical appearance, but from years upon years of swinging axes and hauling stone and wrestling the wilderness into something that resembled, if you squinted and were generous with your definitions of life. Their skin was darkened by sun and wind, roughened by cold that would make a city man weep, scarred by the small and large violences that the mountain demanded as payment for the privilege of living on its back. They moved through the streets of Bedloe Gulch like three ships moving through a harbor designed for smaller vessels, taking up more space than the town seemed prepared to offer, their boots heavy on the wooden sidewalks, their shadows long in the afternoon light. Judson was the eldest, by 7 minutes, which is not a large margin by any standard of measurement. But Judson Ferris had been using those 7 minutes as justification for giving orders since he could walk. He carried himself the way a man carries a loaded weapon, with absolute awareness of what he was and what he was capable of, and the quiet confidence that comes from never having encountered a situation he could not handle through some combination of silence, strength, and sheer immovable will. His jaw was hard cut from the same stone as the mountain he lived on, and his eyes were the color of whiskey held up to firelight, amber and deep, and carrying within them a warmth that never quite reached the surface. His silence was the heaviest thing in any room he entered. It had weight. It had texture. It pressed against the walls and the ceiling and the other people in the room like something physical, something you could lean against if you were brave enough, something that would crush you if you were not. When Judson Ferris spoke, which was seldom, people listened. Not because his words were particularly wise, though they often were. Not because his voice was particularly commanding, though it carried with a low, steady authority that made contradiction feel pointless. People listened because the alternative was to ignore a man who looked like he could break a door frame by walking through it sideways, and nobody in Bedloe Gulch or anywhere else in the territory had ever been foolish enough to test that proposition. Prosper was the middle brother, and he was quieter still. But his silence was a different animal from Judson's. Where Judson's silence felt like a wall, solid and unyielding, and built for the specific purpose of keeping the world at a distance, Prosper's silence felt like deep water. Calm on the surface, unknowable underneath. The kind of water that looks still until you drop a stone into it and realize it is far deeper than you imagined, and that things are moving down there in the dark that you cannot see and probably do not want to. He was the craftsman among them. The one who shaped wood into furniture with a patience his brothers did not possess, working a piece of pine or oak for hours with his hands and his tools until the grain revealed itself, and the object that lived inside the wood emerged clean and smooth and exactly right. He was the one who mended fences when they broke and sharpened tools when they dulled and noticed things the others missed. A hinge that was starting to loosen, a crack in a beam that would become a problem in the spring thaw. The way the wind shifted direction 3 days before a storm, carrying with it a scent that only someone who had spent his entire life paying attention to the mountain would recognize. His eyes were the same whiskey amber as his brothers, but softer somehow, as though they had been worn smooth by years of watching the world without judgment. Prosper Ferris did not look at people the way Judson did, measuring and assessing and calculating the distance between what they were and what they needed to be. Prosper looked at people the way he looked at a piece of wood before he began to carve, with curiosity, with patience, with the understanding that what you see on the surface is never the whole story, and that the real shape of a thing only reveals itself to someone willing to sit with it long enough. And then there was Ransom. Ransom was the storm. The youngest, by 11 minutes, with hair the color of dark autumn leaves, auburn brown, where his brothers were chestnut and sun-streaked. Ransom Ferris burned with a heat that never cooled. He carried anger the way other men carried pocket watches, always on his person, always within reach, consulted frequently and wound tight. His eyes were the same amber as his brothers, the same shape set at the same depth beneath the same heavy brow, but they burned hotter, fiercer, as though someone had lit a fire behind them on the day he was born, and no amount of mountain wind or winter cold or passing years had been able to extinguish it. There was a scar on his left shoulder where a bullet had grazed him in a bar fight 3 years past, a disagreement over a card game that had escalated the way disagreements do when whiskey is involved and neither party is willing to be the first to back down. The other man had drawn a pistol. Ransom had not drawn anything. He had simply walked toward the gun, and whether it was the shock of seeing a man advance into a bullet or the trembling of a hand holding a weapon, It should never have pulled. The shot went wide, tearing a furrow across the top of Ransom's shoulder that bled for 2 hours and left a scar he wore the way a soldier wears a medal. Without apology, without explanation, without any of the theatrical storytelling that most men would have attached to such a wound. Ransom did not tell the story because Ransom did not believe the story required telling. The scar spoke for itself. But it was not their size, or their silence, or even Ransom's famous temper that made the Ferris brothers legendary in the territory. It was the women. Every few months, with a regularity that the people of Bedloe Gulch had come to anticipate, the way farmers anticipate the changing of seasons, the stagecoach would rattle up the mountain road carrying another hopeful bride. They came from the east, these women, from Philadelphia and Boston, and the small towns of Pennsylvania and Ohio and Connecticut, where the factories were loud and the opportunities were few, and the future stretched out before them like a road that went nowhere they wanted to go. They came in white gloves and bonnets with nervous smiles pinned to their faces like brooches and hands so delicate they had never known the weight of an axe or the blistering heat of a cook stove that burned all day and all night through the winter months just to keep the frost from creeping through the walls and settling into the bones of everyone inside. All of them had read the letter. The advertisement that Judson had placed in newspapers back east, written in the same blunt, unadorned prose that characterized everything Judson Ferris committed to paper. A man of property, a cabin in the mountains, honest work and honest living. Seeking a woman of good character, willing to make the journey west and build a life in the high country of Colorado Territory. What the letters did not mention was that one husband was actually three brothers, that the home was a cabin on a mountain so high and so remote that the nearest neighbor was a 2-hour ride through dense forest on a trail that disappeared entirely under 6 feet of snow for 4 months of the year. That honest work meant splitting firewood until your palms cracked and bled skinning game, until the smell of blood became as familiar as your own name, hauling water from a creek that froze solid in November and did not thaw until April, and surviving winters so brutal and so relentless that they could kill a grown man if he made one careless mistake. One moment of inattention, one wrong step on an icy trail, one night without enough wood on the fire. The brides came anyway. They always came, because hope does that to people. It makes them brave enough to board a stagecoach and ride for days into country they have never seen toward a man they have never met, trusting a letter they cannot verify, carrying with them nothing but a carpet bag and a prayer, in the desperate, unshakable belief that the life waiting for them at the end of the road must be better than the one they are leaving behind. Hope is the most powerful force in the human heart, more powerful than fear, more powerful than common sense, more powerful than the stories whispered in saloons by men who should know better, because hope does not listen to stories. Hope listens only to itself, and every single one of them left. Some lasted 2 days. They arrived on the mountain, saw the cabin, saw the 3 enormous men who lived in it, felt the cold wrap around them like a fist, and broke before their first full day was done. They wept openly, standing in the clearing in front of the cabin, with their carpetbags clutched to their chests, begging Cornelius to come back for them, promising Maud and anyone else who might be listening that they would never again in their lives make the mistake of answering a newspaper advertisement from a stranger in the wilderness. Some lasted 4 days. These were the more determined ones, the women who gritted their teeth and told themselves they could endure this, they could adapt. They could learn to live in a cabin that smelled of smoke and leather, and men surrounded by a wilderness that pressed against the windows at night like something alive and hungry. They lasted through the first awkward meals, eaten in silence across a rough pine table. They lasted through the first freezing morning when the water in the basin beside the door had turned to ice overnight. They lasted through the first howl of wolves rising from the dark forest below, a sound that reached into the chest and wrapped cold fingers around the heart. But on the 4th day or the 3rd night or some moment between them that they could never afterward precisely identify, something inside them reached its limit, and they broke. The strongest among them made it almost to the end of the 6th day before breaking. A woman from Vermont, the story went, who had grown up on a farm and knew how to work with her hands and was not afraid of cold or isolation or the hard, unromantic realities of frontier life. She lasted 5 days and 20 hours before the sound of the wind, the relentless screaming sanity, eroding wind that came down from the peaks at night and threw itself against the cabin walls with a fury that made the timbers groan, finally defeated her. She packed her bag in the dark, walked to the door and stood there shaking until morning, when Cornelius arrived with the stagecoach and found her sitting on the porch with her carpetbag in her lap and tears frozen on her cheeks. Not one of them lasted a full week. By the time the eighth bride fled in the dead of winter, wrapped in every blanket she could carry, half frozen and weeping so hard she could barely see the trail, stumbling down the mountain, in boots that were meant for church floors and not for 6 inches of ice-covered rock. The legend of the Ferris brothers was carved in stone, as deep and as permanent as the names on a gravestone. 3 men cursed to live alone on the mountain. 3 men no woman could endure. 3 men destined to grow old and die in the high country without the warmth of a wife or the laughter of children or any of the small, soft human comforts that make a house a home and a life worth living. The men in the saloons shook their heads and said it was a shame. The women in town clucked their tongues and said it was inevitable. The preacher said it was the will of God, which was what the preacher said about everything he could not explain, which was most things. And gradually, the way water stops flowing from a spring that has dried up, the bride stopped coming. The letters stopped arriving. The advertisements Judson had placed in the Eastern papers went unanswered. The stagecoach climbed the mountain empty and came back down empty, and the Ferris brothers became what the territory had always expected them to become. A story, a warning, a legend whispered over campfires by men who had never climbed the mountain and never intended to. That was the story as Bedloe Gulch knew it. But stories have a way of changing when the right person walks into them. The way a river changes when a boulder drops into its current. The way a sky changes when the sun breaks through after a week of rain. The way a room changes when someone opens a window that has been closed for years and lets the air in and the silence out. And on a cold October afternoon in the year 1875, with the sky the color of old pewter and the first bite of winter sharpening the air like a blade being drawn across a whetstone, the right person arrived. She came on the afternoon stagecoach from Denver, the last leg of a journey that had begun 12 days earlier in a small town in Pennsylvania, whose name she had already begun the work of forgetting. She came alone, which was the first thing that made her different from every bride who had come before. The others had arrived in clusters when they could manage it, traveling with companions or chaperones, or at the very least clutching a letter of introduction from some well-meaning church lady back east, who believed that a piece of paper with a clergyman's signature could serve as adequate protection for a young woman traveling alone into territory that had not yet fully decided whether it wanted to be civilized. Theodora Bancroft had none of these. No companion, no chaperone, no letter of introduction, no church lady's blessing. What she had was a carpet bag with a broken clasp that she had repaired herself using wire and a pair of pliers borrowed from a blacksmith in Kansas City, a navy blue traveling dress that had been presentable 12 days ago, but was now creased and stained with the accumulated dust of 1,000 miles of unpaved road, and a cameo brooch pinned at her throat. The brooch was oval, carved from shell, depicting the profile of a woman whose features bore a resemblance to Theodora's own, and it caught the weak October light and held it like a small, stubborn flame that refused to go out no matter how hard the wind blew. The brooch had belonged to her mother. It was the only thing of her mother's that Theodora still possessed, the only physical object that connected her to the woman who had given her life, and then through no fault of her own, had been taken from that life far too early. She was 21 years old and she had no one in the world. This was not self-pity. Theodora Bancroft did not traffic in self-pity. She had tried it once at the age of 14, lying on the narrow bed in the room where she had slept since childhood, crying into a pillow that smelled of lye soap and the faint fading ghost of her mother's perfume. And she had discovered that self-pity, while temporarily comforting, produced nothing of practical value. It did not put food on the table. It did not mend torn stockings. It did not stop the world from spinning in its indifferent, merciless orbit, carrying her forward whether she wanted to go or not. So she had set self-pity aside the way a woman sets aside a dress that no longer fits, without ceremony, without sentiment, and she had never picked it up again. What she had instead of self-pity was arithmetic. Cold, clear, honest arithmetic. The kind that does not lie and does not comfort and does not pretend that the numbers add up to anything other than what they are. Her mother had died when Theodora was 12. A fever. The kind of fever that swept through small towns in those years, the way fire sweeps through dry grass fast and hot and utterly without discrimination, taking the young and the old, the strong and the frail, the loved and the forgotten, with a randomness that made the survivors question whether God was paying attention or had simply looked the other way. Her mother had been 34 years old. She had been sick for 6 days. On the seventh day, she closed her eyes and didn't open them again. And 12-year-old Theodora sat beside the bed holding a hand that was still warm and understood with a clarity that no child should be required to possess that the world had just changed in a way that could not be undone. Her father, or rather the man her mother had married when Theodora was 6 years old, had never looked at the girl as anything more than an inconvenience attached to the woman he wanted. His name was Horace Bancroft, and he was a clerk in a feed store, a man of modest means and immodest appetites, who had married Theodora's mother for reasons that had everything to do with her beauty and nothing to do with the small, serious child who came as part of the arrangement. After Theodora's mother was buried in the churchyard on the hill above town, Horace drank. He drank the way some men pray regularly and without any evidence that it was producing results. And when he was not drinking, which was not often, he was reminding Theodora in ways both spoken and unspoken that she was a mouth he did not wish to feed, a burden he had not chosen, an obligation that had outlived its justification. She endured 9 years of this, 9 years of thin soup and thinner affection, of cast-off dresses and cast-aside dignity, of sleeping in a narrow bed in a cold room, and waking each morning to the understanding that the roof over her head was not a gift, but a grudge. At 21, the arithmetic changed. Horace remarried. His new wife was a woman named Renata Sharp, faced sharp-tongued with eyes like two chips of slate, set in a face that appeared to have been designed by someone who believed that kindness was a structural weakness. Renata moved into the house on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, she had taken inventory. By Thursday, she had reached her conclusions. And on Friday morning, she stood in the doorway of the bedroom Theodora had slept in since childhood, looked at the narrow bed and the small wooden dresser with its cracked mirror, and the shelf where Theodora kept the 3 books she owned, and delivered the verdict that Theodora had been expecting for years, but that still landed with the force of a slap across the face. There is no room in this house for another woman's child. The words were spoken without heat, without malice even. They were delivered with the flat administrative efficiency of a woman closing an account that should have been closed long ago. There is no room. The matter is settled. Please collect your things. Theodora left that afternoon. She did not argue. She did not plead. She did not give Renata the satisfaction of seeing tears, because Theodora Bancroft had learned through years of practice that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend on people who would not value them. She packed her mother's cameo brooch, a change of clothes, and what little money she had saved from years of taking in other people's laundry work she performed in the evenings after the day's chores were done, washing and pressing and folding other women's dresses and petticoats and returning them spotless, or for pennies that she kept in a tin box hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. She found a boarding house in town, a tall, narrow building on Elm Street with peeling paint and a front porch that listed slightly to the left, run by a woman named Mrs. Odile Voss, a widow of 63 who had buried 2 husbands and 1 son, and had emerged from these losses not hardened but clarified the way glass is clarified by fire, all the impurities burned away, leaving behind something transparent and surprisingly strong. Mrs. Voss took Theodore in, not out of charity, which Mrs. Voss did not believe in, but out of exchange. Theodora scrubbed the floors and washed the linens and cooked the meals and managed the accounts, and in return she received a room on the 3rd floor, small but clean, with a window that looked out over the rooftops of town toward the hills in the distance, and 3 meals a day, plain but sufficient. And Theodora survived. She had always been good at surviving. It was the one skill her life had taught her thoroughly and well, the way a blacksmith is taught to work iron through repetition and heat, and the understanding that the material either hardens under pressure or it breaks and there is no middle ground. The letter arrived 3 months later. Mrs. Voss delivered it herself, setting the newspaper clipping on the kitchen table one morning while Theodora was kneading bread dough, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, flour dusting her forearms like fine white snow. A man named Ferris is looking for a wife out in Colorado Territory. Mrs. Voss said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of a woman who has seen enough of life to know that the most important moments rarely announce themselves with fanfare. Mountain country, hard living. But he has land and a cabin, and he is looking for a woman of good character. She paused. She studied Theodora with eyes that had been watching people for 63 years and had developed through long practice the ability to see past the surface of a face to whatever was operating underneath. You have more character than any woman I have met in 20 years of running this house, child, she said. Might be worth writing, Theodora wrote that night. She sat at the small desk in her third-floor room, dipped a pen in ink, and composed a letter by the light of a candle that kept guttering in the draft from the window, each flicker sending shadows jumping across the walls like nervous animals. She did not write about her feelings. She did not describe her hopes or her dreams or her vision of what a life in the mountains might look like. She wrote about what she could do. She could cook, she could clean, she could mend clothes and preserve food and tend a fire and manage a household. She could work hard. She could endure discomfort. She was not afraid of cold or isolation or the kind of labor that left a person too tired to think at the end of the day. She sealed the letter and posted it the next morning and did not expect a response and received one 4 weeks later. Judson Ferris's letter was short, 2 paragraphs, written in a hand that was large and angular and pressed so hard into the paper that Theodora could feel the impressions of the words on the back of the page as though the man writing them had been trying to carve the letters into the paper rather than simply placing them there. The letter was blunt. It was devoid of romantic flourish. It contained no compliments, no endearments, no promises of happiness or comfort or any of the sweet, reassuring words that a woman might expect from a man inviting her to travel 1,000 miles to become his wife. He described the land. He described the cabin. He described the work. He did not describe himself. He did not use the word love or any of its cousins or any word that lived within shouting distance of love. He wrote the way a man lays fence posts, straight and plain and meant to last. Theodora read the letter twice. Then she folded it and placed it inside the cover of her Bible and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked out the window at the hills in the distance and thought about what she had and what she did not have and what she might have if she was brave enough to reach for it. She had a room on the third floor of a boarding house. She had a job scrubbing floors. She had 3 meals a day and a roof over her head and the quiet, steady companionship of Mrs. Voss, who was kind in the way that water is wet naturally and without effort, but who was also 63 years old and would not be running a boarding house forever. She did not have a family. She did not have a future that she could see past the next week or the next month. She did not have anyone in the world who would notice if she disappeared tomorrow, except Mrs. Voss, who would notice because she would need someone else to scrub the floors. She accepted, not because she believed in fairy tales. Theodora Bancroft had stopped believing in fairy tales at the age of 12, kneeling beside her mother's bed watching the life drain from the face of the only person who had ever loved her without condition or reservation. Fairy tales required faith, and faith required trust, and trust required evidence. And the evidence of Theodora's 21 years on Earth suggested strongly that the world was not a place where handsome princes arrived on white horses and carried you away to kingdoms of gold. The world was a place where you scrubbed floors and saved pennies and hoped that the roof did not leak, and that the winter was not too cold, and that the man you were trusting with your future was at least honest, if not kind. She accepted because she had learned at 21 years of age that the world did not hand you a life. You had to walk into one yourself, eyes open, spine straight, and refuse to be turned away. The journey west took 12 days. 12 days of stagecoaches and trains and stations where the food was bad and the coffee was worse and the benches were made of wood so hard it might have been quarried from the earth rather than cut from trees. Theodora slept when she could, which was seldom. She ate what was available, which was less. She watched the country change outside the windows. The green hills of Pennsylvania giving way to the flat, endless plains of Kansas and Nebraska, which gave way in turn to the rising, darkening, increasingly formidable terrain of eastern Colorado, where the land began to buckle and heave and climb towards something enormous and ancient and utterly indifferent to the small human vehicles crawling across its surface. The stagecoach driver's name was Cornelius, and he had been driving the route from Bedloe Gulch up to the Ferris cabin for 9 years. He was leathery and crooked, his spine bent from years of sitting on hard seats in all weather, his face tanned to the color and texture of old saddle leather, his fingers stained yellow from tobacco. He chewed with the grim determination of a man who had given up on all other pleasures and was holding on to this one with everything he had. When Theodora climbed aboard in Bedloe Gulch for the final leg of the journey up the mountain, Cornelius looked at her from his driver's seat. He looked at her the way a doctor looks at a patient he knows he cannot save, with sympathy, with resignation, with the particular gentleness that people reserve for those who are about to walk into something terrible and do not yet know it. He saw what he always saw: a woman, young, small, alone, carrying a carpet bag and a hope that the world had not yet managed to beat out of her, though judging by the worn state of her dress and the careful way she held herself, the world had certainly been trying. "You sure about this, miss?" he said not unkindly as the horses stamped and snorted in the cold October air, their breath rising in white plumes against the gray sky. He paused, searching for the right words, which was not a skill he practiced often. "They say no bride lasts up there with those boys. The mountain swallows them whole." Theodora settled herself on the hard wooden seat. She tucked her carpet bag beside her feet. She straightened her spine, which was already straight, because Theodora Bancroft's spine had been straight since the day she walked out of her stepfather's house and had not bent since. She was not tall, 5 feet and 3 inches in her boots, slender with the kind of delicate build that made people assume she was fragile, that a strong wind or a hard word or a difficult day might snap her like a dry twig. People had been making that assumption about Theodora Bancroft for 21 years, and they had been wrong every single time. "I have been swallowed before," she said quietly. "Came out just fine." Cornelius looked at her for a long moment. Then he grunted the sound of a man who has heard everything he needs to hear and has decided that further conversation is unlikely to change anything. He cracked the reins. The horses lurched forward. The coach began to climb. The road rose beneath them like a serpent uncoiling, winding upward through terrain that grew wilder and steeper with every turn of the wheels. The trees thickened, pine and spruce and Douglas fir, their trunks rising straight and tall on either side of the trail like the columns of a cathedral built by something far older and far less forgiving than any god worshipped in the churches Theodora had known. The branches interlocked overhead, filtering the gray October light into something dimmer and greener and more uncertain, as though the forest were pulling a curtain across the sky and asking the world below to accept that what lay beyond was not its concern. The air changed as they climbed. It grew thinner, sharper, each breath pulling less oxygen into lungs that were accustomed to the thick, humid air of Pennsylvania lowlands, not the lean, cold atmosphere of Colorado high country. It tasted different up here. Iron and pine sap and the clean, mineral bite of snow that had not yet fallen, but was gathering in the clouds above like an army assembling behind a hill waiting for the order to advance. And the world below disappeared. Theodora watched it go. She watched the valley floor drop away behind curtains of pine and granite, watched the rooftops of Bedloe Gulch shrink to the size of matchboxes, and then to nothing at all, watched the last evidence of human habitation vanish behind a bend in the trail as completely as if it had never existed. And in its place rose the mountain, enormous, silent, ancient beyond comprehension, rising on all sides like the walls of a fortress, built to keep something in or something out, and Theodora sitting at the bottom of it, small and alone, and heading upward. She did not sleep. She watched the mountains rise around her, and she thought about what waited at the top. One husband the letter had promised, one home, one chance. The stagecoach creaked and groaned and shuddered over rocks and ruts, the wooden frame protesting the abuse with sounds that reminded Theodora of an old man complaining about his joints. Cornelius guided the horses with the quiet competence of a man who has made this journey so many times that his hands know the route even when his eyes cannot see it, and the trail narrowed and narrowed until it was barely wide enough for the coach to pass without scraping the rock walls that pressed in on either side, like the jaws of something closing slowly. Then the trees opened, the trail leveled. Cornelius set the brake, climbed down from the driver's seat with the stiff, painful movements of a man whose body had been at war with his profession for decades and had long since lost, and opened the coach door. "End of the line, miss," he said. Theodora Bancroft stepped out of the stagecoach and onto the hard-packed earth of a mountain clearing, and the world she had known ended, and a new one began. The air hit her first, thin and sharp and alive in a way that city air never is carrying, the scent of pine and cold stone and the faint wild musk of animals she could not name. Animals that lived in the dark timber below and the rocky slopes above and regarded the clearing and the cabin and the humans who inhabited them with the patient and sentimental attention of creatures who had been here first and would be here last. The sky was enormous, so wide and so close, it made her feel as though she could reach up and press her palm flat against the clouds, and below the valley fell away in folds of dark green timber that stretched to the horizon like a sea frozen in mid-wave. And above the peaks of the Rocky Mountains rose in jagged white teeth against the gray October sky, and they were the most beautiful and the most terrifying thing Theodora Bancroft had ever seen. And there, leaning against a split-rail fence 20 yards ahead, stood not one man. 3. Theodora's breath caught in her chest like a bird that has flown into a window and cannot remember how to fly. They were identical. That was the first thing her mind registered, even before the shock of their size had fully settled into her nervous system. The same towering height, well over 6 feet, the same massive shoulders that blocked out the landscape behind them like three doors slammed shut against the world. The same sun, darkened skin and hard-edged jawlines and eyes that burned the color of whiskey in firelight. They stood like three pillars carved from the same mountain, three monuments to the particular kind of strength that is not cultivated in gymnasiums or developed through exercise but grown slowly and painfully through years of labor, so demanding it reshapes the body the way water reshapes stone. The one in the center had his arms folded across a broad chest. A leather vest hung open over a rough cotton shirt, the fabric straining across muscles that years of swinging axes and hauling timber had carved into something that looked less like a human body and more like something assembled from the same materials as the mountain itself. His expression was stone. His eyes, amber and cold, moved over Theodora from the crown of her dusty bonnet to the soles of her travel-worn boots, with the detached precision of a man appraising a horse at auction. Measuring, calculating, deciding before a single word had been spoken what she was worth and what she was not. Judson Ferris, the one on the right, stood half a step back as though positioning himself deliberately at the edge of the scene rather than the center. His hair was lighter than his brother's, sun-streaked brown, and his face carried the same hard features, the same heavy jaw and deep-set eyes and broad forehead, but arranged with a gentleness that the other two did not possess. As though the same sculptor had carved all three faces from the same stone, but had used a softer hand on this one, rounding the edges, smoothing the planes, leaving behind something that was still unmistakably hard, but carried within it the possibility of kindness. His eyes watched Theodora not with judgment or hostility, but with something closer to careful curiosity, the way a man watches a wild bird land on a fence rail, holding his breath, wondering if it will stay or startle. Prosper Ferris, and the one on the left. Even before he opened his mouth, even before he moved or spoke or did anything at all to announce his intentions, Theodora could feel the anger radiating off him like heat from a stove that has been burning too long and too hot. His hair was darker than the others, auburn brown, and there was a scar on his shoulder visible through the open collar of his shirt, a pale ridge of healed skin that traced a line across the muscle and spoke of a bullet or a blade that had come close enough to kill but had settled for marking him instead. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like the cords of a rope pulled to its limit, and his eyes, the same amber as his brother's, burned not with curiosity or calculation, but with open, unconcealed, unashamed hostility. Ransom Ferris. 3 men. Not one. 3. The letter had said Judson Ferris, landowner, seeks a wife. It had not said Judson Ferris and his 2 identical brothers living together in one cabin on a mountain so high and so remote that the only witnesses to your life would be the wolves and the weather and the God who had put them all here and appeared to have forgotten about them since. Theodora's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel it. Each beat a small, sharp impact like a trapped bird throwing itself against the bars of a cage it does not understand. Her hands wanted to tremble, her knees wanted to buckle, her eyes wanted to go wild, and her mouth wanted to open, and her lungs wanted to release the scream that was building in her chest like steam in a kettle. The scream that said, "What are you doing here? What have you walked into? Turn around, go back before it is too late." But Theodora Bancroft did not scream. She did not tremble. She did not let her knees buckle or her eyes go wide or her courage crack because she knew with the instinct of a woman who has been surviving on her wits since childhood that if she showed fear now in this moment in front of these three men, she would be the ninth bride to fail before the week was out. She would be another name added to the legend. Another woman who came up the mountain with hope in her heart and left with nothing but tears and the bitter knowledge that hope for all its power is sometimes not enough. She thought of the boarding house, the narrow room on the third floor, the floor she scrubbed on her knees. She thought of Horace and Renata and the bedroom door closing behind her for the last time. She thought of her mother's face on the pillow, still and pale and forever gone. She thought of Mrs. Voss and the newspaper clipping and the letter written in a hand so hard and blunt it might as well have been carved into the page with a chisel. She thought of all the places in the world that had told her she did not belong. And then Theodora Bancroft, 21 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, weighing approximately 110 pounds with her boots on, standing alone on a mountainside in front of three of the largest and most dangerous-looking men she had ever seen in her life, did the only thing she knew how to do. She lifted her chin. "You are the new bride." Judson's voice came across the 20 yards of open ground between them, like something rolled downhill. Deep. Not quite a rumble, but close. The way distant thunder is close to the sound of boulders shifting at the base of a cliff. It was the voice of a man who did not waste words the way he did not waste firewood, each one selected for a purpose, each one carrying exactly the weight it needed to carry and not an ounce more. Theodora held his gaze. Amber eyes met cornflower blue across the cold October air, and in that meeting was the first small collision of two forces that did not yet understand each other, but would in time come to understand each other better than either of them was prepared for. "The letter said one husband," Theodora replied. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her because her heart was still hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "Nobody mentioned three." From the left, Ransom laughed. It was not a warm sound. It was the laugh of a man who finds confirmation in disappointment. The sound you make when the thing you predicted would happen happens exactly the way you said it would. Short, sharp, carrying an edge that could cut if you got too close. "You see, Judson," he said, and his voice was rough. Gravel poured into a tin cup, abrasive and hard and carrying no music at all. "Another little sparrow about to fly off. Give her 10 minutes and she will be begging for the coach back down." Theodora turned her eyes to Ransom. She looked at him, this man whose anger was so large, it seemed to occupy its own space in the clearing, separate from his body, a presence that radiated outward from him like heat from a fire that has been left to burn too long. She looked at his clenched jaw and his burning eyes and the scar on his shoulder, and she understood with an intuition that she did not yet have the information to support, but that her gut recognized as truth, that this man's hostility was not personal. It was practiced. It was armor. And it had been worn for so long that he had forgotten it was armor and had come to believe it was skin. She did not respond to him. Not yet. That would come later. Judson had not reacted to his brother's words. He had not flinched, had not turned his head, had not given any indication that Ransom had spoken at all. His amber eyes remained fixed on Theodora with the steady, unblinking attention of a man who is accustomed to making assessments quickly and acting on them without second thought. He studied her the way a man studies a piece of ground before he decides whether to build on it, measuring, testing, looking for the flaw that would make the whole thing collapse. Then he spoke again, and what he said changed everything Theodora thought she knew about why she was standing on this mountain. "The law out here requires proof of family settlement to hold a homestead claim," Judson said. His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man laying out facts the way he might lay out tools on a workbench. Each one in its place, each one needed for the job at hand. A wife, a marriage certificate. Without that, the claim can be challenged, and there are men who want to challenge it. He paused. The wind moved through the pines behind him, and somewhere in the valley below, a hawk cried its voice thin and sharp against the enormous silence of the mountain. "That is why I wrote the letter," he said. "That is why you are here." Theodora stood very still. The wind pulled at her skirts and tugged loose strands of honey blonde hair across her cheeks, and the cold pressed against her face like the flat of a blade. She looked at Judson, whose face was carved from the same granite as the mountain behind him. She looked at Prosper, whose soft amber eyes held a question he would not ask, a question that lived somewhere behind his careful stillness and would remain unspoken until someone gave him permission to release it. She looked at Ransom, whose hostility was so fierce, it was almost a physical force, a wind pushing against her chest, testing whether she would lean into it or be blown backward. A marriage of paper, a transaction. She was not here to be loved or courted or cherished. She was not here because Judson Ferris had looked at her letter and seen a woman he wanted to know, a woman whose words had stirred something in him, a woman whose character and courage had reached across 1,000 miles and touched something in his heart. She was here because he needed a signature, a name on a document, a piece of paper that would keep the land beneath his feet from being pulled away. And Theodora understood. She understood because she had spent her entire life being useful to people who did not particularly want her, but who needed something she could provide. She had been an inconvenience to her stepfather, a burden to his new wife, a pair of hands to Mrs. Voss. She had learned through 21 years of hard education that the world does not love you for who you are. It tolerates you for what you can do. And if you are wise, you do not waste your time wishing it were otherwise. You find the place where what you can do is needed, and you plant yourself there, and you grow. Understanding made her decision not harder but simpler. So Theodora said, planting both feet firmly on the cold, hard earth of the clearing, adjusting the carpet bag in her hand with the casual precision of a woman who has been carrying her own weight since before she could remember. Who is going to help me with my luggage? Or does this marriage start with me carrying all the weight by myself? Behind her, Cornelius choked on his tobacco. In 9 years of driving brides up the mountain road, he had seen every possible reaction to the moment of arrival. He had seen tears immediate and uncontrollable, streaming down faces that had been brave in Denver and Kansas City, but could not maintain the pretense in the face of 3 mountain men in a wilderness that looked like it had been designed by someone who actively disliked human beings. He had seen silence, the stunned open-mouthed silence of women whose imaginations had constructed a picture of their new life that bore absolutely no resemblance to the reality standing before them. He had seen anger sharp and hot directed at Judson, or at Gao, or at whatever friend or relative had encouraged them to answer the advertisement. He had seen one woman, the third bride, turn around without a single word and climb back into the coach, and sit there with her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead, as though by refusing to acknowledge what she had seen, she could make it not exist. He had never seen this. A small woman in a dusty blue dress standing in front of 3 of the largest men in the Colorado Territory and cracking a joke. Judson blinked. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but Cornelius saw it from his perch on the driver's seat, and it struck him as significant because Judson Ferris did not blink. Judson Ferris's eyes were open from the moment he woke until the moment he slept, and possibly during sleep as well. Watching the world with the tireless vigilance of a man who had learned early that the things that hurt you most are the things you do not see coming. Slowly, Judson stepped forward. He reached down and lifted her carpet bag from the ground beside her feet, and he lifted it the way he lifted everything, as though it weighed nothing at all, as though gravity had made a special arrangement with the Judson Ferris, whereby the normal rules did not apply. Then he turned without a word and began walking up the narrow trail toward the cabin, his broad back receding up the slope, like a wall moving away from her. Prosper nodded once. The motion was so slight it barely moved his chin, a gesture so small that a person who was not paying close attention might have missed it entirely. But Theodora was paying close attention because Theodora Bancroft had spent 21 years learning to read the small signals that people send when they do not want to send large ones. And what she read in that tiny nod was not hostility and not welcome, but something in between. Acknowledgement. The recognition that she existed and that her existence had been noted and filed away for future consideration. He followed his brother up the trail. Ransom spat on the ground. The gesture was deliberate and theatrical, the kind of casual contempt that is designed to communicate a message without the inconvenience of having to articulate it in words. He turned his back on Theodora and walked away without looking at her, his massive shoulders squared against the mountain air, his stride long and angry and carrying him up the slope as though the act of walking away from her was itself a form of argument. Theodora followed. Her boots crunched on the gravel steady, and even each step placed with the deliberate care of a woman who knows she is being watched and refuses to stumble. Her breathing was controlled, though the thin mountain air was already working against her, each breath requiring more effort than the last, as though the atmosphere itself were testing her commitment. Her hands did not shake. Behind them, Cornelius shook his head slowly. He climbed back up to the driver's seat with the weary, resigned movements of a man who has seen this play performed too many times and knows how it ends. He gathered the reins in his tobacco-stained fingers and looked down at the horses, who looked back at him with the patient, unsurprised eyes of animals who have been waiting for the humans to finish their business and would like to go home now. Poor woman, Cornelius muttered to the horses as he released the brake and turned the coach around on the narrow flat. She will be gone before the week is out. Mark my words. But Theodora did not hear him. And even if she had, it would not have mattered, because Theodora Bancroft had spent her entire life listening to people tell her what she could not do, and she had found through extensive testing that their predictions were unreliable. The trail to the cabin was a test all by itself. It climbed steep and narrow through pine forests so dense the branches interlocked overhead, like the fingers of hands folded in prayer, blocking what little light the overcast October sky was willing to offer, and replacing it with a green dimness that felt like being inside something. Something alive. Something that was watching. The trail switchbacked up the mountainside, each turn revealing another stretch of rocky ground that climbed at an angle that would have been challenging for a mule and was approaching cruelty for a woman in a traveling dress and city boots. The air grew thinner with every step. Theodora could feel it the way you feel a pocket being picked, something being taken from you so subtly that you do not notice until you reach for what should be there and find it gone. Each breath pulled less and less oxygen into lungs that were accustomed to the thick, rich air of Pennsylvania lowlands, and her body responded the way anybody would respond to being asked to work harder with less fuel. Her heart rate climbed. Her calves burned. Sweat gathered at her temples despite the cold running down the sides of her face in thin lines that she wiped away with the back of her hand without breaking stride. Her dress snagged on branches. Thorns caught at her sleeves and tore small holes that she would mend later, with the quiet, methodical patience of a woman who had been mending things her entire life. Her boots, which had been adequate for the streets of small-town Pennsylvania and the platforms of railroad stations, were wholly unprepared for mountain rock, and she could feel blisters forming on both heels before they were halfway up the skin, rubbing raw against leather that had not been designed for this terrain and was letting her know it. But she did not stop. She did not ask for rest. She did not call out to the three men ahead of her who moved with the long, tireless strides of animals born to this terrain, their legs eating up the distance as though the mountain were flat ground, never slowing, never pausing, never once looking back to see if the woman behind them was keeping up, or had fallen behind, or had simply sat down on a rock and given up the way 8 women before her had given up in their own way at their own breaking point. She put one foot in front of the other. She climbed. She breathed. She endured. Because Theodora Bancroft had learned long ago that the world does not wait for women who stop to catch their breath. It moves on without them and does not apologize. When the trees finally opened into a wide clearing, the cabin stood before her like something conjured from the stories men tell, when the fire is low and the whiskey is strong, and the line between what is real and what is wished for has blurred beyond recognition. It was massive, built from logs as thick as a man's torso, their bark stripped, and the wood beneath darkened by years of weather and smoke to a deep, rich brown that was almost black. The joints were fitted tight, each log notched into the one below it with the precise, careful craftsmanship of men who understood that a gap in a wall at this altitude was not an inconvenience but a threat. The chimney stack rose from the east end of the cabin like a stone pillar, assembled from river rocks and mortar, trailing a thin wisp of smoke into the gray sky that was the only evidence of warmth in the entire landscape. Firewood was stacked in a wall along the west side of the cabin. Stacked was not quite the right word. It was engineered, each log split and seasoned, and placed with the systematic precision of a man who understood that firewood was not decoration, but survival, and that a wall of wood improperly stacked would collapse under its own weight or rot from the inside, or fail in some other way at the exact moment when failure meant freezing to death. The wall was 8 feet high and 20 feet long, and represented, Theodora estimated, more physical labor than she had performed in her entire life combined. Animal hides hung from wooden racks behind the cabin. Bear and elk and what might have been mountain lion, stretched and scraped and drying in the thin mountain air. The smell reached her from 20 yards away. the sharp organic tang of raw animal skin mixed with the mineral scent of the tanning agents the brothers used. And it was not a pleasant smell, but it was an honest one. The smell of men who killed their own food and wore their own leather, and did not pretend that the process of staying alive in the wilderness was anything other than bloody and difficult and necessary. A small stable stood to the rear of the cabin, solidly built from the same heavy timber, its door slightly ajar. Three large horses watched from behind the fence with the wary, alert attention of animals that do not see strangers often and have learned through experience that strangers are not always welcome. Theodora stopped. She placed her hands on her hips. She let her eyes move slowly across the cabin, the wood pile, the hides, the stable, the wish-wide empty clearing, surrounded on all sides by a wilderness that would not hesitate to kill her if she gave it the chance. She took it all in every rough plank and every hanging pelt and every square foot of cold, hard, beautiful, terrifying ground, and she absorbed it the way she absorbed everything completely and without flinching. So this is where brides come to disappear. She said, not quite to herself, not quite to anyone. All three brothers heard her. The clearing was not large and the mountain air carried sound, the way still water carries ripples faithfully and without distortion. Judson turned his head just enough for his cold amber eyes to catch hers. They left because they were not built for this, he said, and his voice was flat as a planed board, smooth and hard and carrying no apology. If you are smart, you will do the same before the first real snow comes. Ransom added from behind his voice that's sharp as a blade driven into wood, the sound of a man who has been waiting for the opportunity to say something cutting and is pleased to find that the opportunity has arrived on schedule. Best to climb back on the coach right now. Save everybody the trouble. Prosper said nothing, but his amber eyes, softer than his brother's, and more patient, rested on Theodora with an expression that was neither hostile nor welcoming. It was the look of a man who has stopped expecting anything from anyone and is therefore unable to be disappointed. The look of a man who has watched 8 women arrive with hope and leave with tears and has taught himself to feel nothing about the process because feeling something would require him to care and caring would require him to be vulnerable. And vulnerability on this mountain was a luxury that no one could afford. Theodora drew a long breath. The thin mountain air filled her lungs like ice water, bracing and painful and alive in a way that the air back east had never been alive. It tasted of pine and stone and distance and the faint metallic edge of winter coming. She looked at 3 pairs of identical amber eyes, each one carrying a different challenge. Judson's challenge was cold and measured the challenge of a man who has built a test and is waiting to see if you pass. Ransom's challenge was hot and hostile. The challenge of a man who has already decided you will fail and wants you to fail quickly so he can get back to the business of being angry at the world. Prosper's challenge was the hardest of all because it was not a challenge, but an absence, the empty space where a challenge would have been if he still believed that anyone was capable of meeting it. You do not scare me, mountain men, Theodora said. Her voice was level and clear and carried across the clearing like a stone skipping across still water. I have lived through worse than cold walls and hard work. Plenty worse. Inside the cabin, the world contracted. The space was large enough for 3 men who had spent 14 years learning to navigate around each other's silences, who had developed the instinctive choreography of bodies that share a confined space and have learned where the boundaries are and how to move without crossing them. Each brother had his territory, his corner, his chair, his particular section of wall where his things hung and his tools rested, and his presence was understood to be sovereign. They moved around each other the way planets move around a sun in fixed orbits, maintaining distances that had been established through years of trial and negotiation, and the occasional collision that had taught all 3 of them that friction in a small space generates heat that has nowhere to go. But with a 4th body added, the space felt smaller, closer. The air thicker with the scent of pine smoke and dried leather, and the particular tension that exists when people who do not know each other and have not chosen each other are forced into proximity by circumstances that none of them entirely control. Theodora stood inside the door and let her eyes adjust. The furniture was rough-hewn, a heavy table of split pine that could seat 6 but bore the marks of only 3 regular occupants, the wood worn smooth in 3 spots and rough everywhere else. 4 chairs, though the 4th looked as though it had been made as an afterthought, and placed at the table out of obligation rather than expectation. A stone fireplace wide enough for a grown man to stand inside, its mouth blackened from years of fires that burned from October to April, and sometimes beyond the stones darkened and cracked and carrying the accumulated residue of thousands of hours of burning wood. Animal skins on the floor, thick pelts of bear and elk that served as both decoration and insulation, their fur worn flat in the paths between the door, the table, the fireplace, and the beds. No curtains, no cloth on the table, no flowers, no ornaments, no pictures on the walls, no evidence whatsoever that a woman had ever passed through this space and left her mark upon it. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and tanned hide and men, sweat and iron and earth. The smell of bodies that work hard and wash when they can and do not apologize for the intervals between. Three beds lined the far wall, large and solid, built from the same heavy timber as the cabin itself, each one separated from its neighbor by hanging pelts that served as makeshift curtains, providing the illusion of privacy in a room where true privacy was impossible. A fourth bed sat in the corner nearest the fireplace. It was narrow and plain, a simple frame with a straw mattress and a single blanket that was thinner than the blankets on the other three beds, and it looked like what it was: an accommodation, a concession, a place prepared not with care, but with the minimum effort required to fulfill an obligation. Judson pointed at the narrow bed, his arm extended from his massive shoulder like a tree limb, the finger at the end of it aimed at the bed with the directional precision of a compass needle pointing north. "You sleep there," he said. "We sleep in ours. The boundaries are clear." "How incredibly romantic," Theodora said. Ransom slammed his open palm on the table. The crack of skin against wood was sharp enough to make Theodora flinch, a small, involuntary contraction that traveled through her body like a current and was gone almost before it registered. She buried the reaction so quickly and so completely that she almost convinced herself it had not happened. Almost. But Theodora Bancroft was honest with herself, always had been, and she knew the truth. She had flinched. The sound, the violence of it, the sudden explosive release of anger that it represented had startled her. And she hated that it had startled her because being startled meant being surprised, and being surprised meant being unprepared, and being unprepared in a place like this with men like these was something she could not afford. "This is not a fairy story," Ransom said through his teeth. His amber eyes burned with the particular fury of a man who feels his territory being invaded and does not know how to respond to the invasion except with aggression. "This is an arrangement. You do your part, we do ours. Nobody owes anybody anything beyond that." But Theodora did not let herself be silenced. She had been silenced before many times by people who were louder and meaner and more powerful than she was, and she had learned that silence, once accepted, becomes a habit that is very difficult to break. So instead of falling quiet, instead of dropping her eyes, instead of retreating to the narrow bed in the corner and pulling the thin blanket over her shoulders and waiting for someone to tell her what to do, Theodora did what Theodora always did when confronted with a situation that was trying to make her small. She made herself useful. She removed her bonnet and set it on the table, the motion deliberate and unhurried, the gesture of a woman unpacking, not for a visit but for a stay. She brushed the trail dust from her skirts with both hands, quick, efficient strokes that sent small clouds of brown powder drifting toward the floor. And then she walked directly to the fireplace. "The fire is too low," she announced, as though she were noting the weather or commenting on the time of day, as though the observation were so ordinary and so obvious that it required no particular courage to make. She picked up logs from the stack beside the hearth. She did not pick them randomly. She selected the driest ones with a practiced eye, running her fingers along the bark, feeling for the telltale lightness and the hollow sound that indicated wood that had been properly seasoned and would burn hot and clean rather than smoldering and filling the cabin with smoke. She arranged them over the dying coals with the careful architecture of someone who understood that building a fire is not about piling wood on top of embers and hoping for the best. It is about creating a structure, airflow, heat distribution, the proper ratio of kindling to fuel to draft. She found the small hatchet hanging from a nail on the wall beside the hearth. She took it down, tested the weight in her hands, selected a piece of pine from the kindling pile, and split it into thin strips with two quick, confident strokes. The hatchet came down clean and true, each blow landing exactly where she intended it to land, and the wood parted with the sound of something giving way to something stronger. She fed the strips into the embers. She blew gently, steadily, coaxing the heat upward into the fresh wood, her breath a warm, even stream that found the glowing coals and encouraged them, the way a patient hand encourages a frightened animal. Within minutes, the fire crackled back to life. Flames leaped and snapped and climbed the new logs with a hunger that filled the cabin with warmth and light that had not been there before, pushing back the shadows, softening the rough edges of the room, making the space feel for the first time like a place where a person might choose to be rather than a place where a person was trapped. She had done it without hesitation, without asking permission, without fumbling or uncertainty, without looking at any of the three brothers to see if they approved or disapproved or cared at all. Her hands were small, but they were the hands of a woman who had spent years tending fires in boarding houses and cramped rented rooms, who knew the difference between a fire that would last the night and one that would die before midnight, who understood that warmth is not a gift the world gives you, but a thing you must create for yourself over and over every day, or the cold will come in and take everything. Judson stopped sharpening his knife. He had been working the blade against the wet stone with the automatic rhythmic strokes of a man performing a task so familiar it requires no conscious thought. But now his hands went still, and his amber eyes moved to Theodora and stayed there for a moment longer than was casual. Longer than was consistent with the careful indifference he had been projecting since she stepped off the stagecoach. Every bride before her had stood in this cabin and shivered, had looked at the fireplace and waited for one of the brothers to tend it, had pulled their shawls tighter around their shoulders and complained about the cold with the wounded, bewildered tone of people who have encountered a problem they expected someone else to solve. This woman walked straight to the problem and solved it herself with the calm efficiency of someone who had been solving her own problems for a very long time and had stopped waiting for anyone else to do it for her. Rowan pretended not to notice. He returned to sharpening his own blade with a deliberateness that was itself a form of communication, the message being that nothing Theodora did or said or accomplished in this cabin was worthy of his attention. But the knife slipped on the whetstone. Just slightly. Just once. A small miss, the blade skating sideways instead of forward. A tiny disruption in the rhythm that only someone watching very closely would have noticed. A small tell from a man who was not accustomed to being distracted and did not appreciate discovering that he could be. Then Prosper did something that none of the brothers expected, including Prosper himself. He rose from his corner, the corner where he kept his woodworking tools and his quiet, the small section of the cabin that was understood by all three brothers to be Prosper's territory, the place where he retreated when the world became too loud or too complicated or too much. He walked to the heavy wooden trunk against the far wall, the trunk that contained the things the brothers stored but rarely used, blankets and extra clothing, and the few possessions that had survived from their parents' life in the valley below. He opened the lid, reached inside, and took out a blanket. It was thick wool, old but clean, washed and folded with the care of someone who understood the value of things that keep you warm. It was the warmest blanket in the cabin, heavier and denser than any of the others, the kind of blanket that could keep a person alive on the coldest night of the year, when the temperature dropped so far below zero that the trees cracked like gunshots in the darkness. Prosper carried the blanket to Theodora's narrow bed. He folded it neatly at the foot, smoothing the wool with his large hands, pressing out the creases with the same patient attention he gave to the wood he carved. Then he returned to his corner without saying a single word. Abayante, not a word, not a glance, not a gesture of explanation or acknowledgement. He simply identified a need, met it, and withdrew. The way water fills a low spot in the ground, quietly, naturally, without asking to be thanked. Theodora watched him go. She looked at the blanket, thick and warm, and obviously the best blanket in the cabin, placed on her bed by a man who had taken it from his own stores. Then she looked at the broad back of Prosper Ferris as he sat down in his corner and picked up the piece of wood he had been carving, his hands resuming their work as though nothing had happened, as though the act of giving a stranger his warmest blanket was so ordinary it did not merit even a pause. Of the three brothers, one of them did not entirely want her gone. That night, the cabin settled into an uneasy silence. Not the comfortable silence of people who know each other well enough to be quiet together, without awkwardness, but the taut, careful silence of strangers sharing a space that is too small for the tensions it contains. Judson stretched out on a bare hide rug beside the fireplace, yielding his bed without being asked an unspoken code of frontier honor that required no explanation and no acknowledgement. The rug was thick, but the floor beneath it was hard, and he lay there with his hands folded on his chest, staring up at the log ceiling with the resigned patience of a man who has slept on worse surfaces and does not consider the floor a hardship worth mentioning. It was simply what you did when a woman was in the cabin and there were not enough beds, and you were Judson Farron, which meant you were the one who made the sacrifices because you were the eldest, and the eldest always made the sacrifices. That was the rule. He had not written the rule, but he followed it. Ransom turned on his bed with the restless energy of a man whose anger followed him even into the hours when the body demands rest. His breathing was hard, his fists clenched and unclenched against the rough blanket in a rhythm that matched no music driven by whatever engine of fury had been burning inside him since long before Theodora arrived and would continue burning long after she was gone. Because she would be gone. Ransom was certain of this. Every bride left, every single one. This one would be no different. She was smaller than most, quieter than some. She had tended the fire without being asked, which was more than any of the others had managed. But that was a trick, a performance, a temporary display of competence that would dissolve the first time the temperature dropped below zero, or the wolves came close enough for her to see their eyes in the dark. She would leave. They always left. Prosper lay motionless and silent in the dark, so still that Theodora could not tell if he was awake or asleep. He breathed away still water moves with no visible disturbance of the surface, and his quietness was so complete that he seemed to merge with the darkness around him, becoming part of the cabin itself. Another timber in the wall, another stone in the foundation, solid and present and making no demands. Theodora lay under the thick wool blanket Prosper had given her, staring up at the log ceiling. The fire cast orange light across the rough wood above her, the flames creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that moved like living things across the surface of the logs. Through the cabin walls she could hear the wind. Not the polite-mannered wind of the Pennsylvania lowlands, the wind that rustled curtains and turned the pages of books left open on windowsills. This was mountain wind, wild and unbroken and answerable to nothing. It threw itself against the cabin with the full force of its accumulated fury, howling through the eaves like something in pain, shaking the shutters in their frames. And beyond, the wind wolves. Their howls rose from the dark forest below, long and mournful and utterly wild, carrying through the trees like the voices of something ancient and hungry, something that had been on this mountain since before the cabin, and the brothers and the long parade of frightened brides, and would be here long after all of them were gone. The sound should have terrified her. It would have terrified the other brides. It had terrified the other brides. One of them, the second, had screamed when the wolves began their chorus and had not stopped screaming until Judson carried her still screaming down to the trail where Cornelius waited with the coach. But Theodora did not scream. She lay still and listened. She let the sound wash over her and through her, this ancient chorus of predators singing to each other across the dark, and she thought about what it meant. It meant the mountain was alive. It meant the wilderness was populated by creatures that were stronger and faster and better adapted to this terrain than she was. It meant that the world outside the cabin walls was not a garden or a park or a pleasant landscape to be admired from a distance. It was a hunting ground, and she was in it. And for the first time since she had been thrown out of her stepfather's house, for the first time since she had stood in the doorway of her childhood bedroom and heard the words that sent her out into the world with nothing but a brooch in a carpet bag and the hard, unbreakable core of herself. Theodora Bancroft did not feel unwanted. The cabin was rough. The men were rougher. The mountain was the roughest thing of all, pressing against the walls like a living creature, testing the strength of what stood against it, probing for weakness, searching for the gap in the armor that would allow it entry. But there was something here, something she recognized, not comfort, not welcome, not the warmth of acceptance or the soft words of belonging. Something harder and more honest than any of those things, a dare. This place, these men, this life, this mountain that swallowed women whole and spat them out, broken and weeping, was daring her to endure, daring her to stay, daring her to be what 8 women before her had been unable or unwilling to be. Not a wife, not a bride, not a delicate creature in white gloves waiting to be rescued or romanced, or treated with the kind of gentleness that has no place in a world where gentleness is a luxury the landscape cannot afford. It was daring her to be enough. And Theodora Bancroft, 21 years old, lying alone in a dark cabin on a mountain she had never seen before today, surrounded by wolves and wind, and three men who did not want her there, closed her eyes and smiled. Because Theodora Bancroft had never once in her 21 years walked away from a dare. The next morning came cold and sharp as a freshly stropped blade, the kind of morning that does not greet you so much as confront you, pressing its cold face against yours and demanding to know what you intend to do about it. All three brothers were outside before Theodora woke. She could hear them through the cabin walls, each one engaged in the particular form of labor that defined his place in the family and his relationship with the mountain. The rhythmic crack of Judson's axe splitting wood came from the west side of the cabin, each log surrendering in a single blow, the sound echoing off the mountain walls like distant gunfire. One stroke, one log, perfect and ruthless and relentless, the sound of a man who does not believe in second chances for firewood or for anything else. The steady tap of Prosper's hammer came from behind the stable where he was mending a fence rail that had loosened during the night. Tap, 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 even and measured. The sound of a man who fixes things, who notices what is broken and what will break, and applies his skill and his patience to the gap between the two. Ransom had vanished into the forest before dawn, with his rifle across his shoulders, moving into the dark timber with the silent, purposeful stride of a man who is more comfortable in the wilderness than he is in the company of people, and who has made his peace with that fact, if peace is even the right word for the arrangement Ransom Ferris had made with the world. Theodora rose. She splashed icy water on her face from the basin by the door, gasping at the cold, which was sharper than anything she had experienced in Pennsylvania, and which informed her without any particular sympathy that the mountain was not interested in her comfort and never would be. She dried her face with a rough cloth, tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. The first week had begun, and the mountain was watching. It always watched. It had been watching the Ferris brothers for 14 years. It had watched them build their cabin and bury their parents and grow from frightened boys into hard men. It had watched 8 women arrive and 8 women leave. And now it watched the ninth, small and determined and refusing to be afraid, and if mountains could feel curiosity, this one did. Because something about this one was different, and the mountain, patient and eternal, was willing to wait and see what that difference would mean. The first week was not a test of her body, though her body was tested in ways it had never been tested before. It was a test of her will. And each of the 3 Ferris brothers, whether they intended to or not, whether they were conscious of it or not, presented a different kind of challenge that wore at her from a different angle, the way water wears at stone, not by striking it once with great force, but by pressing against it constantly from every direction with a patience that the stone cannot match. Judson was the critic. Nothing Theodora did met his standard. Nothing she cooked was seasoned correctly. Nothing she cleaned was clean enough. Nothing she built or mended or organized or arranged satisfied the exacting requirements of a man who had been running this cabin and this mountain and this life for 14 years with the iron precision of a military commander, and who viewed any deviation from his established methods as evidence of incompetence rather than inexperience. The fire was too low. She had banked the coals too early, and the cabin would be cold by 3 in the morning, and someone would have to get up and rebuild it from scratch, which was a waste of wood and a waste of time and a waste of the sleep that no one on this mountain could afford to lose. The firewood she split was too short and would burn out before midnight. The pieces needed to be 18 inches at minimum cut from the center of the log, where the grain was tightest, and the wood was densest, not from the edges, where the grain was loose, and the wood burned fast and hot and left nothing but ash. The stew went on the stove too early, and the meat would turn to mush by evening. Elk meat needed to be added in the last hour, not the first, because the fibers were leaner than beef and broke down faster under heat, and a pot of mush was not a meal. It was an insult to the animal that had died to provide it. The preserves were stored in the wrong jars. The jars were placed on the wrong shelf. The shelf itself was questionable because it had been mounted on the west wall, where the temperature fluctuated most during the day, and preserved fruit stored in fluctuating temperatures would ferment before Christmas, and then they would have vinegar instead of food. Every observation was delivered in the same flat, toneless voice, without anger, without malice, without warmth, without any indication that Judson was aware that the person receiving his criticism was a human being with feelings rather than a piece of equipment that was malfunctioning. He critiqued her the way a drill sergeant critiques a recruit systematically and without any particular concern for the emotional consequences of his assessments. His amber eyes would find the flaw, his mouth would name it, and then he would return to whatever he had been doing before the flaw caught his attention. The matter settled, the correction delivered the expectation of improvement implicit and non-negotiable. Theodora bore it. She bore it the way she bore the cold and the altitude and the blisters on her heels and the ache in her muscles that started each morning before she was fully awake and did not end until she collapsed onto her narrow bed at night. She bore it because she understood, even in the first days, when the understanding was more intuition than knowledge, that Judson's criticism was not cruelty. It was instruction. Brutal, graceless, emotionally illiterate instruction delivered by a man who had never learned how to teach without first tearing down, but instruction nonetheless. He was telling her how to survive. He was giving her the information she needed to keep the cabin warm and the food preserved and the fire burning through the night, and if the delivery was harsh, the content was accurate. And Theodora had learned long ago to separate the message from the messenger and take what was useful and discard the rest. Ransom was worse, but in a different way. He did not criticize because criticism implied that he cared enough about her work to evaluate it. Criticism required attention, and attention required acknowledgement. And acknowledgement required him to concede that she existed as something more than a temporary inconvenience, a stray animal that had wandered into the cabin and would wander out again once it realized there was nothing here for it. Ransom offered none of these things. Instead, he erased her. He walked past her as though she were a piece of furniture that someone had placed in an inconvenient location. He moved her chair aside without looking at her when she was sitting in it. He took food from the pot without acknowledging who had cooked it, eating with the mechanical efficiency of a man fueling a machine, tasting nothing, appreciating nothing, treating the act of eating as a necessary transaction between his body and the work it needed to perform, rather than as a meal prepared by another person's hands. When Theodora spoke, which she did less often than she might have because the cabin's silence was so thick it felt like speaking required cutting through something, Ransom's eyes passed through her as though she were made of glass. Not invisible exactly, transparent, present but irrelevant, occupying space without mattering to the space she occupied. It was a particular form of cruelty, the cruelty of erasure, and it was more effective than Judson's blunt criticisms because it attacked not her competence but her existence. Judson told her she was doing things wrong, which at least acknowledged that she was doing things. Ransom behaved as though she were not doing anything at all because she was not there at all, because she did not matter at all and never would. Theodora bore this too, but she bore it differently. She bore Judson's criticism with patience because patience was the correct response to instruction. She bore Ransom's erasure with stubbornness because stubbornness was the only response to a man who was trying to make her disappear. She existed harder. She took up more space. She cooked louder, stirring the pot, with decisive strokes that clanked the ladle against the iron sides. She moved through the cabin with deliberate, unhurried steps that placed her directly in Ransom's path, forcing him to go around her, rather than through her, requiring him at minimum to acknowledge the physical reality of her body, even if he refused to acknowledge anything else about her. It was a war of presence fought in the small arena of a log cabin on a mountainside, and Theodora intended to win it. Prosper was the mystery. He spoke less than either of his brothers, which was saying something since neither of them spoke much at all. The three Ferris brothers together generated less conversation in a day than most people generate in an hour. And Prosper was the quietest of the three, occupying the deepest end of a silence that was already profound. But unlike Judson's pointed criticisms or Ransom's aggressive erasure, Prosper's quiet had a different texture entirely. It was not a weapon, and it was not a wall. It was something else, something Theodora could not quite name in those first days, something she sensed more than understood, the way you sense the current in a river before you see the surface move. He left a newly sharpened knife on the kitchen table one morning without being asked. Theodora found it when she came to prepare breakfast, the blade honed to an edge so fine it caught the firelight and threw a thin line of reflected gold across the table surface. She had not mentioned that the kitchen knife was dull. She had not complained about the effort required to cut through elk meat with a blade that had lost its edge. She had simply done it sawing through the meat with extra force, adjusting her technique to compensate for the tool's deficiency, the way she adjusted to everything in this life, without complaint, without comment. But Prosper had noticed. He had watched her struggle with the dull blade and he had said nothing, and in the morning there was a sharp one on the table. He fixed the wobbly leg on the chair Theodora used without being told it was unsteady. She came to sit down one evening and found the chair solid, the leg that had been loose now fitted tight, the joint reinforced with a small wooden wedge that had been shaped with the precise, patient craftsmanship that characterized everything Prosper touched. He did not mention it. He did not point it out. He did not look up from his carving when she sat down and felt the difference and paused for a moment, understanding what had happened and who had done it. And once, when she could not find the cutting board, a wooden board she used for preparing vegetables and slicing bread that had gone missing from its usual spot beside the stove, Theodora spent an hour looking for it, checking every surface and shelf and corner of the cabin before giving up and using the table instead. The next morning, the cutting board appeared on the counter. Its surface had been planed smooth and clean. The rough patches that had been collecting grime sanded away the edges, squared, the whole thing restored by hands that valued craft and care and understood that a tool properly maintained will serve you longer than a tool neglected. He never claimed credit. She never offered thanks. It was a conversation conducted entirely in wood and silence, in the language of objects that appear where they are needed and hands that fix what is broken without being asked. And it said more, far more than words could have managed. 3 brothers, 3 walls, and Theodora small and determined, looking for the cracks. She found the first crack on a Wednesday afternoon midweek after Judson had informed her with his usual flat precision that she had used too much salt in the evening stew. It was the 7th criticism of the day. Theodora had been counting not consciously, not with deliberate intent, but the way a person counts the strokes of a hammer that is driving a nail into the wall of their patience. 1. The fire was too low. 2. The water she had hauled from the creek was not cold enough, which meant she had taken it from the shallow pool near the bank, instead of from the deeper channel where the current ran faster and the water was cleaner. 3. The bandage she had wrapped around a cut on her own hand, a small wound from the kitchen knife that she had treated herself, was too loose and would not stay in place. 4. The biscuits she had baked were too dense. 5. The floor needed sweeping again, which it did because floors in log cabins surrounded by forests always need sweeping again. 6. The clothesline she had rigged between the cabin and the stable was too low, and the shirt she had washed would drag in the dirt when the wind blew. 7. Too much salt, something inside Theodora, something that had been bending under the accumulated weight of 7 criticisms on top of 6 days of relentless, thankless, unacknowledged labor, reached its limit. It did not break. Theodora Bancroft did not break. But it bent far enough to change shape, and the shape it assumed was anger. She dropped the wooden spoon on the table. The clatter was sharp and deliberate, the sound of a woman setting something down with the full intention of picking something else up. She planted both fists on her hips and stared at Judson across the cabin with an expression that would have made a smarter man take a step backward. "You know something," she said. Her voice carried the particular clarity that comes when a person has been pushed precisely 1 inch beyond the limit of their tolerance and has decided that the inch will not be given. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud. It was controlled and steady and edged with a steel that Judson Ferris, for all his experience with blades, did not recognize until it was already cutting. For a man who has lived alone with 2 brothers who cannot boil water without burning it, you certainly have a lot of complaints about my cooking. If I am so useless, cook your own supper. Judson did not lift his head from the whetstone where he was sharpening his hunting knife. The blade continued its steady passage across the stone back and forth, the sound rhythmic and unhurried. If I wanted it done wrong, he said, I would cook it myself. From his corner, Ransom added his contribution, his voice carrying the casual contempt of a man lobbing a stone at a target he considers too easy to miss. How much longer until you pack up and leave? Theodora turned on him so fast her skirts snapped like a sail catching the wind. The motion was swift and precise, pivoting on one foot, her body rotating toward Ransom with the sudden directional force of a weather vane hit by a gust. She fixed him with her cornflower blue eyes, and what burned there was not tears, not frustration, not the wounded hurt of a woman who has been treated unkindly and wants the treatment to stop. What burned in Theodora Bancroft's eyes was a fury as clean and bright as a freshly struck match. "When you decide to speak to me like a human being," she said, and each word landed in the silent cabin like a boot on frozen ground instead of barking like a stray dog chasing strangers, "we can have that conversation. Until then, sit down and eat the stew I cooked with too much salt and be grateful someone in this cabin knows how to feed you." The silence that followed was absolute. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the shutters. A log shifted in the grate and sent a shower of sparks up the chimney that nobody saw because nobody was looking at the fire. Everyone in the cabin was looking at Theodora. Ransom stared at her. His amber eyes were wide, wider than she had ever seen them, the customary narrowing of hostility and contempt replaced by something that looked very much like astonishment. His jaw worked, the muscles flexing and releasing, searching for words that did not come. Nobody spoke to Ransom Ferris that way. Nobody had dared in over a decade. The last person who had addressed him with that level of direct, unfiltered, unapologetic challenge had been a man twice Theodora's size in a saloon in Bedloe Gulch, and that man had ended the conversation on the floor with a broken nose and a revised understanding of the consequences of confronting a Ferris brother. But Theodora was not a man twice her size in a saloon. She was a woman, small, unarmed, standing in his kitchen with flour on her apron and fire in her eyes, and not one single indication that she was afraid of him or impressed by him or willing to be silenced by him. Judson's knife had stopped moving against the whetstone. The rhythmic scraping that had served as the background noise for his criticism, the sound that said, "I am busy and this conversation is not worth my full attention," had ceased. His amber eyes had lifted from the blade and settled on Theodora with an expression she had not seen before. Not anger. Not the cold assessment that was his default response to everything and everyone. Something else. Something closer to the look a man gives a horse that has just cleared a fence he thought was too high. Not admiration exactly, not yet, but the precursor to admiration. The recognition that something unexpected has occurred and that the unexpected thing deserves at minimum a second look. And Prosper. Quiet Prosper sitting in his corner with a half-carved piece of wood in his hands and a blade that had gone still against the grain. He looked up and across his face passed something small and unmistakable. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. The faintest trace like the first light of dawn on a ridgeline, barely visible, easily missed, but there. Present. The shadow of respect for the woman who had just done what 8 women before her had been unable or unwilling to do. She had raised her voice in the Ferris cabin, and she had not broken. The moment that sealed the first week came 2 days later on a cold afternoon when the sky hung low and heavy with the promise of early snow. The clouds so thick and so gray they looked like wool pulled from a blanket pressing down on the mountain with a weight you could feel in your chest. Theodora was outside splitting firewood. She was not graceful at it. She would be the first to admit this if anyone had asked, which no one did because no one was in the habit of asking Theodora anything. The hatchet came down at imperfect angles, striking the log off center, sending one half flying cleanly, while the other remained stubbornly attached, requiring a second stroke or a third, each one less precise than the last, as her arms fatigued and her muscles burned with the accumulated effort of an hour's work without rest. The logs did not always split clean. Some of them twisted on the block and had to be repositioned. Some of them were knotted and refused to give way regardless of how many times she swung. But she kept swinging. Each stroke was an answer to every voice that had ever told her she was not enough. Each impact of blade against wood was a rebuttal, wordless and physical and absolute, delivered to the memory of her stepfather, who had called her a burden, to the sharp-faced woman who had taken her room, to the children who had mocked her in school for her mended dresses and her second-hand boots, to every man who had looked past her, and every woman who had looked down on her, and every moment in her 21 years when the world had weighed her on its scales and found her wanting. She brought the hatchet down and down and down, and if the wood did not split perfect, it split eventually, and that was enough. It had to be enough. Because on this mountain in this life, perfection was a luxury reserved for men with arms carved from granite. And 14 years of practice, and Theodora had neither. She had only will, and will she had learned could substitute for almost anything if you applied enough of it. The sound of something heavy being dragged through timber reached her before she saw them. A crashing, scraping, laborious sound, the sound of tremendous weight being moved through resistant terrain by sheer muscular force. She stopped swinging and looked down the slope toward the tree line, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Judson and Ransom came up the trail from the timberline, dragging between them a bull elk so massive its antlers spread wider than a man's outstretched arms. The animal was enormous, 600 pounds at least, its body heavy with the fat it had accumulated through the autumn months in preparation for the winter that was coming. Even the two largest Ferris brothers men, whose physical strength was legendary in the territory, were straining with the effort of hauling it uphill, their boots digging trenches in the soft earth, their faces set in the grim masks of men performing labor that demands everything they have and then asks for more. Prosper followed behind, carrying traps and coils of rope over one shoulder, a rifle over the other, his stride steady and unhurried despite the weight. He walked the way he did everything with the measured economical movements of a man who has calculated exactly how much energy the task requires and does not intend to spend 1 calorie more. Judson stopped when he saw Theodora at the chopping block. His amber eyes took in the scene with the rapid, comprehensive assessment that was as automatic to him as breathing. The uneven pile of firewood stacked beside the block, some pieces too short, some split cleanly, others mangled. The sweat darkening the collar of her dress, the red rawness of her palms where the hatchet handle had rubbed the skin away, the determined set of her jaw, the jaw that said, "I know this is not perfect, and I do not care because I did it myself." "You are going to dull the blade swinging like that," he said. It was not a compliment. It was not encouragement. It was another criticism delivered in the same flat tone he used for all of his observations filed under the same category as too much salt and fire too low and biscuits too dense. But Theodora heard something in it that she had not heard before. Something underneath the criticism buried so deep that Judson himself might not have known it was there. He had noticed that she was chopping wood, not trying to chop wood, not pretending to chop wood, not standing beside the chopping block with the hatchet in her hand, waiting for someone to come and do it for her. She was chopping wood, badly by his standards, which were the only standards that existed on this mountain. But she was doing it. Theodora dropped the hatchet on the block. She turned on him, chest heaving from exertion, her cheeks flushed with cold and effort, her hair escaping from its pins and flying around her face in the wind, and she fired back without hesitation. "I am going to get the work done, dull blade or not," she said, her voice carrying the particular edge of a woman who has been criticized one time too many, on one day too many, and has decided that this particular criticism will not go unanswered. Not everyone was born with arms carved out of granite, mountain man. Then she did something that changed the arithmetic of the entire week. She strode to the elk. The animal lay where the brothers had released it, its massive body steaming faintly in the cold air, its glass dead eyes reflecting the gray sky above. It was the largest animal Theodora had ever seen up close, its antlers alone weighing more than her carpet bag, its body representing enough meat to feed 4 people for weeks if properly butchered and preserved. She grabbed one of its massive antlers with both hands and pulled with everything she had. She was small and the elk was enormous, and the physics of the situation were laughably, absurdly, impossibly against her. She weighed 110 pounds. The elk weighed 6 times that. She was pulling uphill. The ground was soft. Her boots, those inadequate city boots that had not been designed for mountain rock or mountain mud, slid in the dirt as she leaned back with her full weight, her shoulders straining, her jaw clenched, her entire body committed to a task that her body could not possibly accomplish alone. But she pulled. She planted her boots and she leaned, and she pulled, and the elk did not move, not an inch. But Theodora did not stop pulling. "Well," she said, through her teeth, her breath coming hard, her voice strained but steady, "do not just stand there. Let us drag this beast inside before every wolf on the mountain comes calling." For 2 full seconds, nobody moved. The clearing was silent except for the wind and the distant cry of a hawk and the sound of Theodora Bancroft's boots scraping in the dirt as she strained against 600 pounds of dead elk and refused to let go. Then from somewhere deep inside Prosper Ferris's chest, a sound escaped. It rose up through his body like a bubble rising through deep water, passing through layers of silence that had been accumulating for years, breaking the surface with a soft, rough, startled sound that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same territory. Close enough that Theodora looked at him in surprise, her hands still gripping the antler, her eyes wide. Close enough that Judson turned to stare at his brother with an expression that mixed shock with something deeper, something that looked like recognition, because Judson knew. He knew that Prosper Ferris had not made a sound like that in years, had not laughed or almost laughed or produced any sound that could be classified as an expression of amusement since long before Theodora arrived, since long before the parade of brides, since sometime in the deep past when something inside Prosper had decided that laughter was a risk he could not afford and had shut the door on it and locked it. And this woman, this small, stubborn, impossible woman hauling on an elk antler in a city dress with flowers still dusting her sleeves, had found the key. Together, all four of them hauled the elk to the butchering block behind the cabin. Judson worked the knife with the quick, precise strokes of a man who had been field dressing game since he was old enough to hold a blade, his hands moving through the work with the automatic confidence of deep experience. He opened the animal with a single long cut, separated the hide from the flesh, with motions so economical they seemed choreographed, and began breaking the carcass into manageable sections with the methodical efficiency of a man who understood that every minute a killed animal spent unprocessed was a minute the meat was losing quality. Theodora stood beside him. Her sleeves were rolled above her elbows, her forearm bare and pale in the cold air, her small hands positioned and ready. She did not ask what to do. She watched what Judson did and anticipated what he would need next. When he cut a section to meat free, she was there with the salt, packing it tight into clay crocks with layers of coarse salt between each piece, working the crystals into the flesh with her fingers the way she had seen Judson do it the day before. Blood spattered her apron. It soaked into the fabric and stained her hands and got under her fingernails, and she did not flinch. She did not gag. She did not look away or cover her mouth or make any of the sounds of disgust that the other brides had made when confronted with the reality of where meat comes from. She salted the meat as Judson cut it. She packed it into crocks. She carried the heavy crocks to the cool storage shelf inside the cabin, her arms trembling under the weight, but her steps steady. And when the work was finished, when the elk had been reduced from an animal to provisions, when the hide had been scraped and stretched on the drying rack, and the bones had been set aside for broth, and the blood had been washed from the butchering block, Theodora wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of red across her pale skin like war paint, and she stood straight. There she sat, breathless but upright, family working together instead of barking orders. Not so hard, is it? Judson looked at her, really looked. Not the quick assessing glance he had been giving her for 6 days, the glance that measured and evaluated and filed away data for future analysis. He really looked. His amber eyes, the cold ones, the ones that had measured and dismissed 8 women before her, settled on Theodora Bancroft's face and stayed there. And for the first time, the ice in them cracked. Just a fraction. Just enough for something warmer to flicker through a brief flash of light behind the stone before he turned away and picked up his knife and began cleaning the blade as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. Theodora saw it. She saw the crack, and she saw the light behind it, and she filed both away in the same place she filed everything she learned about the Ferris brothers in the quiet, methodical, increasingly detailed map she was building of 3 men who did not want to be known, but who were revealing themselves anyway, piece by piece, despite their best efforts to remain hidden. Ransom said nothing. He had watched the entire scene from the edge of the clearing, leaning against the fence rail, his arms crossed over his chest, his face arranged in its customary expression of hostile indifference. But his jaw, which had been clenched like a steel trap since the moment Theodora stepped off the stagecoach 6 days ago, loosened. Just slightly. Just enough for the muscles along his neck to relax by a fraction, the way a rope relaxes when the knot holding it is loosened by 1 degree. He would have denied it if anyone had pointed it out. He would have denied it so forcefully and so angrily that the denial itself would have proved the point. But it happened. That evening, as the last light faded behind the peaks and the sky turned from gray to purple to the deep, starless black that came down on the mountain like a lid being placed on a box, the cabin filled with the rich scent of elk stew and wood smoke. Theodora had made the stew with the fresh meat, adding the dried wild onions she had found growing in a sheltered spot behind the stable and the root vegetables she had stored in a cloth sack beneath her bed. She seasoned it carefully, tasting as she went, and when Judson sat down and tasted it and did not comment on the salt, she understood that she had achieved something. Not approval. Judson Ferris did not approve. He assessed, and if his assessment found no flaw, his silence served as the highest form of praise he was capable of offering. The absence of criticism was his standing ovation. Theodora Bancroft had done what no bride before her had managed. She had not cried, she had not begged, she had not fled. She had stood in the cabin of 3 mountain men, looked each one of them in the eye, and refused to be dismissed. She had tended their fire and cooked their food and split their wood and salted their meat and wiped elk blood from her face, and she had done all of it without asking for anything in return except the right to be treated as a person rather than a problem. And the Ferris brothers, for the first time in 14 years, sat around a table where 4 bowls steamed instead of 3, and they were not certain whether they wanted her gone, or whether in some place they were not yet willing to examine some locked and guarded room in the deep interior of their mountain-hardened hearts they wanted her to stay. The first snow came early that year, and though the mountain had been holding its breath and finally decided to exhale, it began on the last day of October with thin flakes scattered and lazy drifting down from a sky the color of old iron like feathers shaken from an enormous gray bird passing overhead. Theodora stood in the cabin doorway and watched them fall, each one dissolving the moment it touched the warm ground, as though the earth was not yet cold enough to hold what the sky was offering. By noon, the flakes were thicker, falling faster, tumbling over each other in their hurry to reach the ground. By evening, they fell in curtains, dense white curtains that blocked the view of the trees and the valley, and turned the world beyond the cabin into a shifting, swirling, featureless white void. And by the time Theodora woke the next morning, pulling the heavy wool blanket Prosper had given her tight around her shoulders, the world outside had been transformed. White, everything white. The trees bowed under the weight of it, their branches drooping like the arms of old men carrying burdens they were too tired to set down. The woodpile was buried to its second row. The fence posts around the stable had disappeared entirely, replaced by smooth, rounded mounds. And the only sound was the wind, low and steady and cold, pressing against the cabin walls like a hand testing the strength of a door or it intended to open. The brothers knew what this meant. 14 winters on this mountain had taught them the arithmetic of survival. Calories consumed against calories burned. Firewood stacked against nights below freezing. Meat stored against mouths that needed feeding. Get the numbers wrong and the mountain collected the debt. Judson doubled his hunting. Ransom expanded the trap lines. Prosper turned his attention to the cabin itself, moving along the walls with careful fingers, searching for gaps where the cold would find its way and stuffing moss and clay into every crack, reinforcing the doorframe, climbing onto the roof to check every joint and seam. And Theodora threw herself into the work alongside them, learning to salt meat the way Judson showed her to smoke venison on the rack Prosper built above the hearth, to identify which jars needed the cool corner and which needed the higher shelves near the fire's warmth. She did not complain, not when her hands cracked from the cold, not when her back ached from hours bent over the hearth. She worked, and when the work was done, she found more work, because idleness on this mountain was not a luxury. It was a death sentence. Each evening, as the wind howled through the eaves, Theodora kept the fire burning and the stew pot full, and hummed the old hymns her mother used to sing when Theodora was small enough to sit on her lap and believe the world was kind. The sound filled the cabin with something that had not existed there before. Not warmth, because the fire provided that. Something else. Something softer. The sound of a woman's voice in a place that had known only the low tones of men for 14 years. And Prosper began sitting closer to the fire in the evenings, carving small objects from scraps of wood. A new wooden spoon appeared on the kitchen shelf one morning, then a coat hook by the door, then a small rack for the spice jars Theodora had organized. Each item appeared without announcement, placed where she would find it, and know without being told that someone in this cabin noticed her work and valued it enough to make it easier. a conversation in wood and silence, saying more than words ever could. Then the blizzard came. It roared down from the high peaks like the wrath of something enormous and mindless, a wall of white fury that slammed into the mountain and made the cabin shudder on its foundation stones. Within hours, the door was buried. The windows were blind. The world beyond the walls ceased to exist. 3 days. They were sealed inside for 3 days. By the second day, the provisions looked thin. Judson sat chewing the last strip of dried jerky, his eyes fixed on the remaining stores, and Theodora saw his shoulders tighten. She saw him counting. She saw him doing the arithmetic. That evening, Theodora made broth. Thin broth stretched from bones she had been saving with the last of the dried wild onions. She ladled 3 full portions into 3 bowls and set them before the brothers. Each bowl had what little meat she could scrape from the bones. Then she filled her own bowl halfway. Clear broth, no meat. Prosper noticed first. His spoon stopped halfway to his mouth, suspended in the air, his amber eyes moving from his bowl to hers and back again. You did not take your share. Theodora shrugged one shoulder and blew across the surface of her broth. I do not need as much. Men who chop wood and haul timber burn through more fuel than a woman who stitches socks by the fire. Prosper looked at her, steady, unwavering, the kind of look that sees past words to the truth underneath. Judson glanced at her bowl, then at his own. He stopped chewing. For the first time since she had known him, he ate more slowly. The next night she did it again. Less for herself, more for them. She slipped a scrap of bone to Pike the hunting dog, who had stationed himself at her feet and refused to move his tail, tapping a slow rhythm on the wooden floor. And this time Ransom broke. His spoon came down on the table with a crack that split the silence like a rifle shot. Theodora jumped. Pike raised his head, ears flat. Prosper's hand froze on his bowl. Judson went still. You are going to starve yourself before you quit, are you not? Ransom's voice was rough and low, not the sharp-edged bark she had come to expect. Something raw, something that sounded almost like it hurt coming out. Theodora lifted her chin. The firelight caught her cornflower blue eyes and set them blazing. Rather starve than live as a coward who runs. The word coward hit Ransom Ferris harder than any fist ever had. Harder than the bullet that had grazed his shoulder. Harder than the memory that lived in the deepest part of him, the memory he never spoke about, the one that burned hotter than all his anger combined. He stared at her with amber eyes that were no longer burning with hostility, but with something far more unsettling. Confusion, recognition, the dawning, unwelcome understanding that the woman sitting across from him was made of the same material as the mountain itself. Prosper set down his spoon. Without a word, he pushed his own bowl, still half full, across the table toward Theodora. He did not explain. He did not ask. He simply placed the food in front of her and withdrew his hand, and his soft amber eyes held hers for a moment that felt longer than the 3 days of the blizzard. Eat, please. That night the storm reached its peak. The cabin groaned. The fire burned low. And Theodora woke to find all 3 brothers still awake. Judson sat by the dying fire, his massive shoulders slumped for the first time. He looked like what he was beneath the stone. A man, tired and worn and alone. Ransom leaned against the wall, his hostility drained away, replaced by an exhaustion that went deeper than bone. Prosper sat by the window, listening to the wind as though it were telling him something he needed to hear. You do not sleep much, do you? Theodora said softly. Sleep does not come easy when you are waiting for the roof to fall in, Judson answered without turning. Neither do you, Prosper said from the window. Not a question. Hard to sleep when you know you are living with 3 men who want you gone, Theodora replied. No bitterness, only honesty. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before. Not tense, not cold, fragile. The silence of people standing at the edge of something and trying to decide whether to step forward or back. Then Prosper spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, and Theodora had to lean forward to hear him over the howling wind. Not all 3. 2 words, quiet as snowfall, heavy as stone. Judson turned his head and looked at his brother with sharp, quick eyes. Ransom did not react, did not scoff, did not deny. He looked down at his own scarred, calloused hands and said nothing. And the absence of denial, the silence where a denial should have been, spoke louder than any words Ransom Ferris had ever said. The blizzard broke on the fourth day. Judson dug a path to the woodpile. Prosper checked the stable. Ransom took his rifle into the trees, and Theodora stood in the doorway, Prosper's blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and watched them work. And for the first time since she had arrived on the mountain, she did not see three wild men who tolerated her presence. She saw three brothers who had lost everything as children and had spent 14 years building a life from nothing. Their hardness was not cruelty, it was armor. And armor exists because someone somewhere was wounded badly enough to need it.